Not a knock. Not really. It was more like something collapsing against the wood, using the last of whatever force it had left to make contact. A wet, heavy sound, like a fist wrapped in something that wasn't quite skin. I didn't move for 3 full seconds. The porch light was on, I remember that. Clearly, because the light caught it wrong. The shadows fell at angles that didn't match anything I'd ever seen standing upright. And then the thing shifted, and I realized it was trying to hold itself up against my doorframe. And the reason the shadows were wrong was because the proportions were wrong. The shoulders were too wide, too high. The neck was long in a way that suggested extra joints. The fingers, all 7 of them on the hand pressed flat against my door, were leaving dark streaks as it slid. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 41 years old. I spent 8 years as a field medic in situations I'm not legally allowed to describe in specific detail, and I've seen things that would make most people's minds fold in half just to protect themselves. I'm telling you this not to impress you, but because what I'm about to describe requires you to understand that I am not the kind of person who panics. I am not the kind of person who freezes. I froze. It looked up at me, and that's when I saw the eyes. 2 of them, just 2, which later struck me as the most humanizing thing about it. But they were set far apart and slightly too large, with irises that caught the light, like oil on water, shifting colors without changing. And there was something in that gaze that I had no framework for. It wasn't fear exactly. It wasn't a plea exactly. It was something layered and ancient and completely specific, the way a surgeon's look is specific when they've already calculated your odds and are deciding how much to tell you. It said something, not in English, not in any language, but the sound it made had a shape that language makes, if that means anything. It had the rhythm of desperation and the cadence of a question. And underneath everything, underneath the incomprehensible syllables, there was a tone I recognized immediately because I had heard it in field hospitals and makeshift surgical theaters, and once, memorably, from a Marine who had taken 3 rounds to the chest and still crawled 40 meters to reach me. Help. Whatever it was saying, it meant help. My brain did several things simultaneously. It cataloged the wounds. And there were wounds, serious ones. The dark fluid seeping through what appeared to be a suit of some kind, a material I couldn't identify, matte, black, and dense, with visible tears along the left side of its torso, and what looked like a deep laceration running from just below where a human collarbone would be down across the chest to the lower ribs, if it had ribs. It assessed the threat level and came back with a reading of approximately 0, because whatever this thing was, it was barely holding on to consciousness. It ran a check on its own psychological state and returned inconclusive. And then it did what 8 years of field medicine had trained it to do. It told me to move. I grabbed its arm, the arm closest to me, the one not pressing against the door. And I took its weight across my shoulders, and I dragged it inside. It was heavier than it looked. Not in the way muscle is heavy, in the way dense things are heavy, the way a piece of furniture surprises you when you try to move it because the volume doesn't match the weight. I staggered, caught myself on the wall, and got it to the couch. It collapsed more than sat. For a moment it just breathed, long, slow inhalations that sounded like wind through a partially blocked pipe. And I stood over it with my heart slamming against my ribs, and my hands already moving to pull back the torn edge of the suit to look at the wound. The wound was bad. I don't say that lightly. I've seen bad wounds. This was bad in a way I didn't have vocabulary for yet, because I didn't know its anatomy, didn't know what the dark fluid was, or whether the pale, almost translucent tissue underneath was exposed muscle or something else entirely. But I knew deep lacerations. I knew the look of something that had lost significant volume of whatever was keeping it alive. And I knew that if I didn't stop the bleeding, or whatever this was, it was going to die on my couch. I went to my kit. I keep a serious kit, not a standard first aid box. An actual trauma kit, The kind you maintain when you've seen enough situations to know that living in the rural edge of a county with a 40-minute ambulance response time means you are, functionally, the first line of anything. Tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, pressure dressings, an IV setup I'd legitimately used twice since leaving service. I grabbed it and came back and started doing what I knew how to do, with the full understanding that I had no idea whether any of it would work on something that had never evolved anywhere on this planet. It watched me the entire time. That was the strange part, or one of the strange parts, in a night with no shortage of candidates. It watched me with those wide, oil-dark eyes tracking every movement, and after a moment, it made a sound, lower this time, more deliberate. And then it lifted its arm. The effort was visible, the tremor of something running on empty, and it pressed 2 fingers against the back of my hand, not grabbing, not restraining, just contact, light, careful contact. I looked at it. It made the sound again. It took me a moment, and then I understood. It was telling me I was doing the right thing, not in words. In the way animals communicate when they're scared but not threatening, when they want you to know they understand your intention. It was saying, in whatever language it had available, that it trusted what I was doing. I applied the hemostatic gauze to the deepest part of the laceration. The dark, fluid, I'd started thinking of it as blood because I needed a word for it, slowed. I held pressure with both hands, 30 seconds, 60. The way you do when you know the seconds matter and counting them is the only control you have. My living room was quiet except for its breathing and the sound, of the wind outside and somewhere far off a dog that had been barking since about 30 seconds after I opened the door and hadn't stopped. The bleeding slowed. I exhaled. And then the lights went out. Not just in my house. I saw it through the window. The whole road, the distant cluster of lights. From the farms on the far ridge, everything. A rolling blackout moving from east to west, and it moved fast, faster than a standard grid failure, faster than anything I'd seen since a deployment in a place I won't name where someone had hit a transformer with a very specific kind of ordnance, designed to create exactly this kind of cascading effect. I stayed very still. The thing on my couch made a sound I hadn't heard it make before. Short, sharp. The specific frequency of someone who has been found. I turned slowly to look at it. In the darkness, almost total now, just the pale residue of starlight through uncurtained windows. Its eyes were different. They caught nothing, reflected nothing. They were completely dark. But there was something along its neck, along the line of its jaw, and down to its collarbone, that had begun to emit a faint light, bioluminescent. Subtle. The light you associate with deep ocean things that have adapted to darkness in ways that make human sight feel arrogant. It was trying to go dark. Whatever was out there, and something was out there. Something had killed the lights in a pattern that spoke of surveillance and triangulation rather than accident. It was afraid of it too. It was trying to hide. From them. I thought about my back door. I keep the house locked out of habit, not paranoia. Or at least that's what I'd told myself for the past several years since leaving service. My therapist had suggested gently that the dead, bolts, and the security lights, and the kit, and the way I never slept facing away from the door might indicate a certain level of ambient vigilance that had overstayed its welcome in civilian life. In this particular moment, I was grateful for every single one of her concerns and every single one of my refusals to fully address them. I moved to the window without turning on any light. The road was empty. The driveway was empty. There was nothing visible in the field across the road, nothing moving along the tree line to the north. But there was something wrong with the sky. Not something you could point to directly. Something in the periphery. The way certain things are only visible when you're not looking straight at them. A displacement of stars. A region of the sky that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, hovering at an altitude that was too low for cloud and too still for aircraft. Something was up there. something large. I went back to the couch. The thing, I still didn't have a name for it, didn't have a category for it, was still processing the reality of it in a part of my brain that had apparently decided that for the purposes of the next few hours it would table any existential reckoning and focus on immediate logistics, was still alive, still breathing. It had pulled what remained of its suit partially closed over the wound, which was either instinct or modesty or practicality, and its eyes had adjusted back toward that oil-on-water quality that I was already starting to read as its alert state. It saw me approach and made a sound. I crouched beside the couch so we were level. I said, "What is up there?" I don't know why I used words. It clearly couldn't understand my language any more than I could understand its. But there's something. Facing the completely unknown that makes you reach for the most human tools you have, even when you know they won't work. It watched my mouth move, the way it had been watching my hands move, with that same quality of focused, specific attention, like someone cataloging data in real time. Then it did something I wasn't expecting. It reached up and touched my temple. Just the tips of 2 fingers, barely contact, the same light touch it had used on my hand before. And for 1 second, just a single blink, I saw something. Not a vision. Not in the way that word implies something. Dreamed or imagined. More like a data transfer. A fragment of image dropped directly into the back of my eye without any of the usual processing. A ship. Not like any ship in human media. Not the sleek curves of movie spaceships or the blocky military logic of science fiction. Something organic and enormous and dark. Pocked with structures that might have been weapons or sensors or neither. Moving with a purposefulness that felt predatory even in that half-second flash of second-hand sight. Then it was gone. My temple was cool where the fingers had been. I said, "They're looking for you." It understood something in my tone, if not my words. It moved its head, not a nod, not exactly, but a motion in the vertical plane that registered as a scent. The dog outside had stopped barking. That was worse. I've spent enough time in places where silence is more dangerous than noise to know that when something that's been making sound suddenly stops, it means one of 2 things. Either the threat has passed, or the threat has arrived. I moved to the front window and looked out again. The driveway was still empty. The road was still empty. The field across the road was not empty. There were shapes in the field. Low to the ground, very still, at intervals that suggested a search pattern. Not obviously alien. Not glowing or bizarre or cinematic. If anything, they were too still to be natural. The way a perfectly straight line of fence posts in an old field is slightly wrong because nothing in nature lines up that precisely. They stood at intervals of maybe 20 meters, 8 or 9 of them visible from my angle, and they were facing the house. They were all facing the house. I counted my breaths, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way you regulate when... Regulation is the only thing between you and the version of yourself that makes bad decisions. 3 seconds in, 3 seconds out. Then I turned and walked back into my living room and opened my kit back up. The thing on the couch watched me. "We've got maybe 5 minutes," I said. "Maybe less." I pulled out the tourniquet and set it aside. Not the right application here. I checked the pressure dressing on the wound. The dark fluid had slowed significantly, not stopped, but the volume loss had decreased enough that I adjusted my assessment from critical to serious. It wasn't going to die in the next 10 minutes from blood loss, which meant what might kill it in the next 10 minutes was the thing standing in my field. I looked around my living room. Old house, fieldstone foundation, 2 points of entry on the ground floor, 3 if you counted the cellar door, which I always counted. My rifle was in the back bedroom, locked. I could get to it in 40 seconds if I moved now. I moved. I was back in 28. Not because I'm fast, Because I've done it before. Because the locks and the case and the sequence of it have lived in my muscle memory since the first night I slept. Alone in this house, and my brain, despite my therapist's best efforts, refused to allow it to be anything other than a retrieval sequence I could execute without thought. The thing on my couch looked at the rifle and then looked at me and made a sound. I recognized the tone. Not alarm, not relief. Something assessing, something recalibrating. I know, I said. It probably won't do much. I moved to the side of the window, not in front of it, to the side, the way you stand when you need to see out without being seen, and watched the field. The shapes hadn't moved, and then one of them did. Just one. The leftmost one, the one nearest the road. It moved toward the fence line, and as it did, the porch light, which was supposed to be dead with everything else, flickered. Just once. Like something had passed through a field that interacted with electronics in ways that physics wasn't supposed to allow. I pulled back from the window. Tell me something, I said. I don't know who I was talking to. Maybe myself. Tell me there's something they're afraid of. Tell me there's something that stops them. The thing on the couch breathed. Long, slow, and then it moved. Not collapsing, not struggling. It moved with intention, with a focus that overrode whatever the wounds were doing to its capacity to function. It sat up. It reached into a part of the suit I hadn't noticed, a seam along the inner forearm, and withdrew something. Not a weapon. Not anything I had visual reference for. An object roughly the size and shape of a riverstone, smooth and dark, that seemed to absorb the faint starlight from the windows rather than reflecting it. It held it out toward me. I looked at it. I looked at it. What does that do? I asked. It pressed the object into my hand. The surface was neither warm nor cold in the way that things calibrated to room temperature feel neutral. It was room temperature in the way that something which is maintaining its own temperature at room temperature feels different. Active, not passive. Like something alive choosing to be exactly as warm as you needed it to be. It said something. Long this time. Several syllables in a row, and the tone was specific and serious, and the last few sounds rose in a way that I had heard 1,000 times in my life. It was asking me a question, and I had the absolute irrational conviction, the kind that bypasses analysis and lands directly in the gut, that the question was, do you understand what this means? I closed my hand around the object. I'll figure it out, I said. The shape by the fence had cleared it. It was in my driveway now, and as it moved into the fractionally lighter space nearer, the house, I could see it more clearly. Or I could see that clearly wasn't quite the right word because it was wearing, or generating, or was, a kind of visual distortion that made its edges blur and shift. Humanoid in the general configuration. Bipedal. But the ratios were deeply wrong in ways that triggered something primal, something below language, some alarm system installed by evolution in a time before humans had words for the specific threat, but clearly had encountered enough of it to build in a biological warning system. Whatever this species was, whatever had sent them, humans had met them before. Not recently, not in recorded history, but the alarm system in my gut said, this shape is a predator. This shape has always been a predator. Your ancestors knew this shape and feared it. There were 2 of them in the driveway now. I turned back to the thing on my couch. My patient. I'd started thinking of it as my patient, because you have to organize relationships in crisis, and that was the organization that made the most sense, and it was watching the window. Its bioluminescence had dimmed to almost nothing, hiding in plain sight, making itself as dim as possible. Is there a way to call for help? I asked. Your people. Is there anyone else? It looked at me. It reached up and touched the object in my hand, not taking it back, just touching it, and made a sound. That was the only answer I got, which told me that either there was no one to call, or calling them would make things worse, or the object in my hand was itself the answer to the question, and I just hadn't figured out what it did yet. The front door handle moved. Not the door, the handle. Someone, or something, was testing the mechanism from outside, slow, careful, learning the technology. The way you learn anything unfamiliar, by taking it apart with attention. I raised the rifle. The thing on the couch made a sharp sound, one syllable, harsh, urgent. I didn't lower the rifle. It made the sound again and then, with visible effort, raised one hand, flat, palm toward me. The universal gesture, or close enough to universal. Wait. I kept the rifle raised, but I waited. The handle returned to its resting position. Silence. Then, from the back of the house, from the cellar door, which I always counted, a sound. Not the handle this time. Something else. A frequency below hearing that. I felt in the fillings of my back teeth and in my sternum, and in the soles of my feet through the old wood floors. The object in my hand got warmer. Not room temperature anymore. Warm, active. Something responding to something. I looked down at it. In the near dark, I could see now what I hadn't seen when it was handed to me. The surface wasn't smooth. It was covered in markings so fine they were nearly microscopic, intricate and dense, the kind of thing that takes centuries to develop. And in the warming, some of those markings were beginning to emit light. Faint, blue-white, like fiber. Optic threads lit from one end. The frequency in my sternum increased. I looked at the thing on my couch, and it was looking at the object in my hand and its expression. I was reading expression into a face built for a different planet, which I fully acknowledged even as I did it. But I was also, was focused and tense in the specific way of someone watching something that could go either way. Watching to see what the object would choose to do. I said, "This is a signal, isn't it? This is sending a signal." The frequency stopped. The house went absolutely still. And then something hit. The front wall, not the door, the wall itself, with a force that rattled every window and knocked a photograph off the shelf above the fireplace and sent a crack racing up the old plaster from floor to ceiling. The thing on the couch was on its feet. I don't know how it managed it. I genuinely don't. I had assessed it as barely capable of holding consciousness 20 minutes ago, and now it was standing, one hand braced against the back of the couch, the other reaching toward me. Not for the object, for my arm, gripping it with surprising strength. It turned me toward the back of the house, the cellar. It was telling me to go to the cellar. I thought about the cellar. Old fieldstone foundation, I'd said, which meant the walls were a meter thick in some places, which meant that whatever sensor they were using to triangulate, stone disrupts. Stone has no electromagnetic signature. Stone is old in a way that technology is not. The cellar, I said. Okay. We moved. I won't pretend it was fast. It was leaning on me again, the way it had when I first brought it inside, and I had the rifle and the kit and the object, and the back hallway is narrow, and somewhere behind us the front wall took a second impact that brought more plaster down and filled the air with white dust that caught the object's light and made the hallway look like something seen through gauze. I got the cellar door open. The stairs are steep, always have been. I've taken them fast in the dark 100 times, and I've never felt what I felt as we started down them, which was the absolute screaming certainty of every animal instinct I possess that something was in the field to the north of the house, something additional, something I hadn't accounted for, and it was moving fast. We made it to the bottom. I pulled the door shut above us and shut the interior bolt. The object in my hand was bright now, not blinding but bright enough to see by, and what I saw was the cellar as I'd always known it. Fieldstone walls, hard-packed dirt floor, old wooden shelving with paint cans and tools, the ancient oil tank that I'd converted to propane storage, the workbench along the south wall. And in the light of the object, I could also see that the thing I was supporting was worse than it had been 20 minutes ago. The wound had reopened. The dark fluid was seeping through the pressure. Dressing. I got it to the floor, against the south wall, the stone wall. I reapplied pressure. Above us, the house creaked and shuddered. I heard movement, not footsteps, not exactly, but a displacement of air and the response of old wood and plaster to something passing through spaces it wasn't designed to contain. They were inside. Whatever they were inside my house. My patient looked at the object. I looked at the object. The markings were all lit now, and they were moving. Not the static glow I'd first seen, but something dynamic, something cycling through a pattern that repeated with the specificity of a broadcast. A signal. It was definitely a signal. And something was receiving it. I felt it before I heard it. A vibration in the stone wall that was different from the vibrations above. Not the mechanical shock of impact, but something resonant. Something that matched the frequency of the object the way a tuning fork matches a note. The wall was responding to the signal. The old fieldstone, laid by hand 200 years ago by people who had no concept of what I was sitting in this cellar with tonight, was responding. The object pulsed. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then everything above us went quiet. Not the quiet of absence, the quiet of waiting. I pressed my hand harder against the wound and watched the ceiling and said nothing. My patient's breathing had steadied in the past few minutes. Whatever adrenaline or its equivalent it had available had extended its functional capacity well past where I'd have pegged its limits. It was watching the ceiling too. One hand resting on the floor, fingers spread, feeling the vibration through the dirt the way you'd put your hand on the chest of something to feel the heart. It turned its head and looked at me. It said something. Quiet. 3 syllables. I don't know what it meant. I still don't know. But I've replayed the sound in my memory so many times in the days since that I feel like I almost know the shape of it, the way you almost know the shape of a word in a language you studied, briefly 20 years ago, and never used. Almost. Not quite. Then the cellar door exploded inward. Not a metaphor, not hyperbole. The door, solid oak, 1.5 inches thick, the original door that had hung in this house since its construction, detonated. Splinters, concussive pressure, a flash of something blue-white that was similar in color to the object's light, but fundamentally different in quality, the difference between a candle and a surgical laser. I was already moving before I had made a decision to move. 8 years of the body responding before the brain catches up is one of the few gifts the service gave me that I've never resented. I got between the thing at the base of the stairs and my patient. The thing at the base of the stairs was not like the shapes in the field. Those had been roughly humanoid, wrong in their ratios but interpretable. This was different. This was closer to a command structure. I'd seen enough operational hierarchies to recognize the difference between a search unit and the thing that directs it. This was the thing that directed. It was taller, more certain of itself. And it looked at me with an attention that was worse than the searching look of the others, because this attention was evaluative. It was deciding something. In my right hand I had the rifle. In my left hand I had the object. The object was almost white now, every marking on its surface blazing. The thing at the base of the stairs looked at the object. And for the first time since the front door handle moved, something changed in the quality of the threat. Something shifted, subtle enough that most people would have missed it. Not me. It was uncertain. I'd spent enough time in enough bad situations to know what the moment of uncertainty looks like in an opponent, regardless of species, regardless of the physiological basis of their psychology. It's a micro-hesitation, a recalibration, a half-second in which the thing you've been moving toward with total confidence becomes slightly less total. That's when you push. Always. That's when you push. I raised the object. I had no idea what I was doing. I had a warm, glowing stone of alien origin in my left hand, and a rifle in my right, and a critically wounded extraterrestrial behind me, and a command-class alien military operative at the base of my destroyed cellar stairs. And what I was about to do was entirely instinct. But instinct, built from 8 years of learning to read the room in the worst rooms imaginable. I raised the object, and I held it toward the thing at the stairs, and I said, "This is not yours." My voice was steady. I've trained for steady. The thing looked at the object. The object pulsed. And from above, from somewhere above the house, above the altitude where I'd seen the displacement of stars earlier, something responded. Not light, not sound, a pressure change, sudden and total, like the moment before a storm breaks, except it broke upward instead of down, a negative pressure that pulled rather than pushed, and every remaining window in the house blew outward simultaneously. My patient said something. I didn't look away from the thing at the stairs, but I heard it, and even without language, I heard what it meant. I'd heard that tone before, in the exact coordinates of human expression where it means, "It's working, don't stop, keep going." The thing at the base of the stairs made a sound, not the searching sounds the others had made, not the evaluative silence it had opened with. Something new, something with the register of a communication, directed elsewhere rather than at me. A report. It was making a report. The pressure above intensified. The object in my hand went from white to something else, something past white, something in a spectrum that I could see but had no color word for, a color that exists in the range beyond. Ultraviolet, where human eyes aren't supposed to go but apparently can, at the edges, under specific stimulus, in the dark, with no other reference point. The thing at the stairs took a step back. One step, careful, measured. Then it turned with the precision of something that does not make involuntary movements, does not flinch, does not scramble, only executes deliberate actions even in retreat, and it went back up the stairs. I stood exactly where I was. I did not lower the object. I did not lower the rifle. I counted to 60. Then I counted to 60 again. Then I heard it. The pressure above the house releasing. Not explosively. The opposite. A slow bleed of whatever had accumulated, like a breath let out over a long, controlled exhale. And in the release, a sound that was not quite sound, more like the memory of sound, moving away. Moving upward, moving away. I turned, around. My patient was against the wall, still upright, looking at me with those oil-on-water eyes. The bioluminescence along its jaw had brightened. A different quality now. Not hiding. Something else. The object in my hand was cooling. I said, "Did that work?" It looked at me for a long moment. Then it reached out and put 2 fingers against my temple again. Lighter this time. And what I saw in that half-second download was different from the ship I'd seen before. I saw sky. I saw the displacement of stars I'd been watching all night, but from outside, from above, from the angle of something looking down. And I saw the dark shape I'd been watching pull away. Rising, moving, becoming a point of darkness among points of light, and then becoming indistinguishable. Leaving. I sat down on the dirt floor of my cellar. For the first time since I'd opened the front door, I sat down. The rifle across my knees. The object in my left hand, dim now. Room temperature. Just a river stone with markings I couldn't read. The pressure dressing on the wall across from me soaked through. My patient's dark fluid drying on my hands. Old stone around us. 200 years old, full of a silence that had lasted the better part of an hour and was slowly becoming a different kind of silence, the kind after. I said, "We need to look at that wound again." It watched me as I crossed back to it, as I opened the kit again, as I found fresh gauze and began the work of reapplying pressure to something I still didn't fully understand, but knew was damaged and needed not to be. It watched my hands. It made no sound. And then, quietly, with the care of something that has learned to calibrate its force to the fragility of the thing it's touching, it put its hand over mine. Not guiding. Not taking over. Just there. The same thing you do when someone is helping you and the help is real and you want them to know you know. I worked for 20 minutes without stopping. At the end of 20 minutes, the wound was dressed as well as I could dress it. The fluid loss had slowed to seep rather than flow, and the thing sitting against the fieldstone wall of my cellar looked stable by the only measures I had available, which were, I acknowledged, deeply imperfect measures designed for a completely different category of biology. But stability is stability. The breath was steady. The eyes were tracking. The hand, when I checked its grip by offering resistance, pushed back with measured force. Stable. I sat back on my heels and looked at it. "I don't know what to do next," I said. "I want to be honest with you about that." It tilted its head. That particular motion I'd been reading as attentiveness, and I was increasingly confident that reading was correct. I thought about what I knew and what I didn't. I knew that something had come for it. I knew that the object had done something, sent something, called something, that had made the command class operative reconsider. I knew that whatever had been hovering above my house was gone. I knew that my front wall had taken significant structural damage, that my cellar door was kindling, and that every window in the house had been blown out, and that in the morning, in the light, this would be a scene that required either an explanation or the kind of systematic misleading that I had some experience with from specific operational contexts that I'm still not cleared to discuss. What I didn't know was how long we had, whether they were coming back, whether the object had permanently altered the calculus or just delayed it, whether there were others I could call, whether there were organizations, institutions, protocols, whether the things you hear about when you've served in certain capacities and done certain clearances were real, or mythology, or somewhere in the useful middle ground that serves both purposes simultaneously. And I didn't know, which was perhaps the most pressing operational question. What did it need to survive the next 24 hours that I was actually equipped to provide? I looked at the kit. I looked at my patient. I said food, water, and then I realized I had no idea whether its biology processed either, and asking was going to be useless since we had no shared language, and the touching the temple thing seemed to work for specific kinds of information transfer, but I wasn't sure I could prompt it intentionally, and I had no idea what the physiological cost of it was on its end. It reached into the seam on its forearm, the place it had retrieved the object, and withdrew something else. Small, a container of some kind, sealed. It opened it, a mechanism I couldn't follow, and lifted it toward its own face, inhaling from it. Like an inhaler, or like something that served a function analogous to an inhaler. Its breathing, which had been steady, deepened. Something in the quality of it changed. Medicine. It had its own medicine. I felt the specific relief of a medic watching a patient self-administer something that clearly helps, the relief that contains within it the knowledge that there was a limit to what you could provide, and the patient had something beyond that limit. "Good," I said. "Okay, that's good." It looked at me. It put the container back in the seam, and then it made a sound I hadn't heard it make. A long, rising, very slightly modulated sound that if you stripped away the alien biology of it, if you got down to what the sound was doing rather than how it was being made, was startlingly close to something I'd heard from people in the specific aftermath of specific kinds of close calls. It was exhaling, not physically, figuratively. The sound that means, we are still here. We are still here. I leaned my back against the fieldstone wall, beside it, not across from it. Shoulder almost in contact, the rifle across my legs, the object sitting on the dirt floor between us, dim and quiet. Above us, the house was silent. Outside, the dog, wherever it was, had started barking again, which meant something normal was out there, something the dog recognized as worth addressing in the ordinary way. For the first time in what felt like several lifetimes, but had actually been approximately 90 minutes, the situation had downgraded from immediate emergency to uncertain aftermath, which is, in many ways, the harder state. Immediate emergency has the mercy of consuming all available attention. Uncertain aftermath is where the questions live. I let myself have the questions for approximately 4 seconds. Then I said, "Here's what we're going to do." It looked at me. "We're going to stay down here until it's light. I'm going to monitor you. You're going to do whatever you need to do with that." I gestured at the container. "And then we're going to figure out the next problem. That's it. That's the whole plan." 3 syllables, rising at the end. The same question it had asked me before, I thought. Or close enough. "Yeah," I said. "I understand." The light came in through the cellar's single ground-level window. A strip of glass, barely 8 inches tall, running along the top of the east wall, the kind of window that exists more as a technical concession to building codes than as any practical source of illumination. It came in grey first, then the pale yellow of early winter morning, and it moved across the dirt floor in a slow bar that eventually reached my patient's feet and stopped there as if it had found something worth examining. I hadn't slept. I'd been in too many situations where sleeping in the wrong window meant not waking up to have any romantic notions about rest in a threat environment. What I'd done instead was the field version. Eyes closed, breathing regulated, body as still as possible. Every sense on a rotating low-level scan of the environment. Not unconscious. Not conscious in the full daily sense. Somewhere in the operational middle that the body learns if you ask it to enough times, the kind of rest that doesn't restore you to anything approaching full capacity but keeps you from the specific failure mode of exhaustion-induced decision errors. My patient had done something similar. At some point in the early hours, the bioluminescence had dimmed to its lowest level yet, not disappearing, but becoming something you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. A faint suggestion along the jawline and collarbone, like a pilot light. Its breathing had slowed and deepened. Not the labored breathing of the early hours, not the shallow, guarded breathing of something managing pain. Something closer to actual rest. I watched it breathe. There is something specific that happens when you watch something unfamiliar breathe, and you realize the watching has shifted from assessment to something else, something less clinical. I noticed it, and I noted it, and I filed it in the category of things to examine later, when later was a viable category. Around 5 in the morning, I'd taken the rifle and gone upstairs. Carefully, every step a decision. The house was wrecked. Not catastrophically, not structurally, or at least I didn't think so. I'd need proper light and proper time to assess the east wall, where the impacts had concentrated. But the interior was a map of the night's events. Plaster dust on everything. The photograph that had come off the shelf was in 4 pieces on the floor. Every window frame empty, glass missing entirely. Not broken inward, blown outward, which created a different problem because the temperatures were dropping and an open house in the pre-dawn cold was a secondary crisis I hadn't had bandwidth to address until now. The front door was still on its hinges, which was the most optimistic structural reading I could make of the ground floor. I'd gone through every room, checked every corner, done it twice. Empty. Whatever had been searching was gone. or had pulled back far enough to read is gone. The distinction mattered, and I didn't have the equipment to resolve it, so I operated on the available evidence and returned to the cellar. Now, in the morning light, I climbed the stairs again. The stairs where the door used to be, stepping over the debris, and stood in my kitchen and looked at the situation with daylight clarity, which is both better and worse than darkness clarity. Better because you can see the actual scope of things. Worse because the actual scope of things is frequently more confronting than what you'd estimated in the dark. The scope of things this morning was considerable. I made a list, mentally, the way I'd been trained to organize damage assessments. The east wall had a crack running from foundation to the edge of the roofline that hadn't been there yesterday, visible from inside through the gap where the kitchen window used to be. The front wall was intact, but the plaster on the interior face had fallen away from a section roughly 3 meters wide, exposing the original timber framing, which appeared undamaged. The windows were a uniform loss. The cellar door was a loss. Everything else was cosmetic or manageable. And then there was the matter of the field. I stood at the gap where the kitchen window had been and looked at the field to the north. In the daylight, I could see the marks, not footprints, whatever they'd worn or generated around their feet, left. No conventional impression on the frozen ground. But there were traces. Scorched circles in the frost, faint and evenly spaced, at the intervals I'd observed the night before. 8 of them, plus a 9th larger one near the fence line where the first shape had entered my property. And along the driveway, the gravel was disturbed in a way that had no wind explanation, scattered outward from 2 central points as if something had stood in it, with a very specific pressure distribution. Evidence, which was a problem. Not because I was afraid of what would happen to me. I've navigated complicated official situations before. I've signed documents that described events in language calibrated to leave the actual events unrecorded. I knew how that machinery worked. The problem was the timeline. Evidence management was a daylight, coordinated effort. What I had right now was a single morning and a critically wounded non-human in my cellar. Priorities in sequence. That was the rule. I went back downstairs. My patient was awake. Not stirring toward awake. Awake, eyes open, that oil-on-water quality sharp and present. Watching the stairs as I descended, which told me it had been monitoring sounds well before I came back into view, which told me its sensory recovery had been significant overnight. It tracked me as I crossed to where I'd set up the kit against the south wall, and it watched as I crouched beside it to check the dressing. The wound was different. I've described wounds to people who weren't medics enough times to know that precision matters and that the language of wounds is not the same as the language of everyday injury, so let me be precise. The laceration itself had not closed. The tissue, whatever served as tissue in its biology, had not knit, but the fluid loss had stopped. Not slowed to seep. Stopped. The dressing was stiff with dry, dark fluid, unchanged from several hours ago, and the edges of the wound, which had been ragged and open when I'd first seen them, had changed in character in a way I'd never seen in a human wound. They had drawn inward slightly, not closing but consolidating, organizing themselves toward closure in a way that implied the process was active and intentional rather than the passive biological luck of a clean wound healing well. It was healing itself, or trying to, or deploying some mechanism for which I had no human equivalent. I sat back on my heels and looked at it. It looked at my expression. It had, I'd noticed, a significant capacity for reading expression. Reading my face with the kind of attention that implied it had spent the night building a working model of human emotional display or had accessed something like that capacity from a different source. It made a sound, calm, steady. I translated it as, "This is expected." "Okay," I said, "so your biology handles it." It made the 3-syllable sound. "I need to figure out what to do about the house," I said. "The windows, the field. There are traces out there that need to be addressed before anyone drives by. I live on a rural road, but rural roads have trucks, and I've already had one neighbor who walks his dog along the fence line every morning, and if he sees the field before I do something about it, I have a problem. I was narrating to something that couldn't understand my words. I knew that. But the alternative was silence, and I'd learned, in the field, that silence in a cellar with a dim light and a wounded companion was a psychological threat that required management, and narration was one way to manage it. Make the brain work. Keep it sequential. I'm going to go cover the windows with the plastic sheeting I have in the garage, I said, and then I'm going to deal with the field, and then I'm going to come back down here and think about the medium-term problem. It watched me stand. I was halfway to the stairs when it made a sound, sharp, single syllable. I stopped. It pointed, not at me, at the gap in the stairs where the door had been, at the space above the stairs. And then it pointed at itself. And then it made a motion with both hands, flat palms facing down, a slow pressing downward. Stay. Down. It was telling me to stay down. I looked at the top of the stairs, at the pale rectangle of morning light falling down from the kitchen. Someone's there, I said. It didn't react to the words, but it held the gesture. Stay down. I moved back against the south wall and crouched and put the rifle against my shoulder and waited. 40 seconds. 50. And then I heard it. A sound from outside that would not have registered if I hadn't been in a listening state. The specific compression of frozen gravel that means a vehicle moving slowly. The kind of slow that is either lost or deliberately cautious, and in either case means someone within view of my front approach. The vehicle stopped. I heard a door. One door. No voices. Footsteps on the front porch. The specific hollow sound of the boards, which I know as well as I know my own breathing. Then a knock.